Performance and engagement. Let's talk about that. It's just really two elements, but we're going to cover it as one because oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, highly engaged workers are also high performers. There are a few notable exceptions, but in general, that's the case. And so what you see here is what percentage of your workforce is high performers. In recent years, that's become a less critical metric. Why? Because many organizations have instituted either a formal or an informal bell curve. In other words, they only allow a certain percentage of their workforce to be classified or rated as high performers, which is in some ways really good and in some ways not so good. The real one that we find to be great and still consistently great is paid for performance incentive differential. If someone is in fact a high performer, how much more are you giving them in terms of salary increase or bonus? Or other kind of incentive or recognition, additional training and career path development. What are they getting that the average performer is not getting? So if you're giving your average performers 2% and your high performers 4% salary increases, that's, by the way, a 200% differential or a 2x differential, which, by the way, is about what we would say you want to give to your high performers. And it creates that incentive to have more high performers. But here's the question or the challenge. What if some departments, groups, even an entire line of business, is 40 or 50% high performers? What if they're doing a fantastic job of bringing in, training, developing, and retaining great talent, and they're outperforming their market, outperforming the other lines of business, outperforming their competitors? Are you still going to force them to only have 10 or 20% high performers? Now you've taken sort of the positive aspect of a bell curve and differentiated workforce to a negative, which is you've not allowed any exceptions, even when business performance seems to justify it. So what we would argue is never use a forced curve, use an informal curve, and if there's an exception, if a manager, a cost center, or a line of business wants to argue or ask for an exception to have a larger percentage of the workforce be considered or rated as high performers to get those higher benefits, higher incentives, higher bonuses, let them go before a committee and make their case. And if they actually can show the business results to justify it, give it to them, because that's how you get more of the same. Whereas if you arbitrarily and blindly follow the rule, you're probably going to lead to a lot of those high performers leaving, going to somebody else, which would be the least of what you want. That would be the worst case scenario, is losing high performers to a peer competitor. Employee engagement rate and index is another one, by the way. That's the same as basically your employee engagement overall rating score, whether you have to ask one question or 75 questions. So this is based on an earlier study in the original War for Talent, and the War for Talent is back. It's 2018, the War for Talent is back. One of the interesting questions which was asked among senior management professionals is what's the difference in terms of output, performance output, between a high performer and an average performer. So they were actually looking at, so to speak, operational workers, salespeople, management roles. The one that we would disagree with here, we agree in general with the concept, but we would actually say the differential between a high-performing manager and an average manager can actually be 2 to 3 to 500, even 1,000%, meaning great managers are going to get a lot more out of their workforce for a lot less cost. Versus the salespeople, that's more of an individual contributor role. Still easier to measure, but not as impactful because, by the way, the ultimate fulcrum is a manager. A great manager can get a much higher level of productivity out of 10, 20, 100 workers, whereas a great salesperson is going to get it out of one. Unless we're talking sales leadership, maybe then we can combine best of both worlds. All right, so here's our case study story in terms of leadership and performance rating differential. Another one of my favorite stories. And what this really shows is that a secret sauce exists in some companies who do take the time to have employee and manager self-service rating. So managers fill out the official rating at this particular company, but employees did a self-serve evaluation of themselves. And the two were compared side by side. In some cases, the managers would adjust the performance ratings. In most cases, they would not. However, what we found is something really valuable across multiple years of data here, showing that the lowest turnover rate, so what you see here on the vertical axis is turnover rate or attrition. And what you see is the gap or the differential between the employee's self-evaluation rating and the manager rating on the horizontal axis. So those who had the closest rating, when the manager and employee rating were very close, had the lowest overall attrition rates, especially among the low positions like customer service, call center, basic, like in this case, a financial services company, so basically bank branch employees. So when the employee and the manager were very closely aligned on the performance rating, turnover rating was the lowest, retention was the highest. What we saw is a huge predictor. And by the way, it didn't matter whether the manager rated higher, and you would think they would usually rate lower. In some cases, the manager rated higher and the employee was very self-critical. It didn't matter which way. As long as you had a significant gap between the employee and the manager, you saw a much higher attrition rate. This was an excellent secret sauce metric that we came up with for the organization. It basically said you can't share this with the employee and the manager except indirectly to the manager, and saying that they need to do a really good job of communicating with the employee. Because what we saw, this is actually a proxy for great communications and management of expectations. So in some cases, you can think about it. If the manager just wants to align here, all they have to do is match whatever the employee rates themselves at. But employees are smart. They'll figure out that that's what their boss is doing, and they'll start giving inflation to their ratings. They'll start raising their ratings. And if the manager wants to keep playing that game, they're going to be in trouble because they're going to be rating all their employees as very, very high performing, which is where they'd come from. In this case, this was more about the managers doing a really good job of giving the employees feedback over the course of the year and keeping the expectations very much aligned with where reality was coming in. So when there was little or no difference between the employee and the manager, either higher or lower, you had the lowest attrition rate, the highest performance. And oh, by the way, they also had the highest engagement rate and the highest level of performance overall in terms of business results. Surprise, surprise. All right, so you can see the summary of the case study here and a little bit of the difference in terms of percentages, 10% versus almost 50% turnover rate. Enormous difference in terms of different kinds of job levels. Now, obviously different rates depending on how you rank them.